You think you're failing because you've been pushing for weeks, months, maybe years, and nothing seems to change. No results, no reward, just resistance. So you start asking the dangerous question, what if this is pointless? But what if the resistance you're feeling isn't proof you're failing? What if it's proof you're 10 centimeters away from breakthrough? There is a moment most people never talk about, the moment when effort starts to feel pointless. Not because you're lazy, not because you didn't try, but because you did try again and again, and nothing changed. That was the moment Ethan was standing in. The drought had lasted months. The ground around his small farm had turned into cracked stone. The cornfields were dying. The animals had stopped producing milk. Every morning, the same question waited for him before the sun even rose. How long can we survive like this? Ethan had one option left: dig a well. Simple idea, brutal reality. The first few days felt hopeful. The soil was loose. Every shovel felt like progress. He imagined the moment water would rise from the earth. He imagined his children running across green fields again. So he kept digging day after day, week after week. The hole grew deeper, 5 feet, 10 feet, 15. By the 6th week, the work stopped feeling heroic. It felt heavy. The dirt had become harder, the sun burned longer, the shovel felt heavier in his hands. But he kept going, because stopping meant accepting something he wasn't ready to face, that there might be no water at all. By the 8th week, his hands were no longer hands, they were wounds. Blisters torn open, skin split across the palms. Each swing of the shovel sent a sharp pulse through his arms. But he kept digging, because once you invest that much effort, quitting feels like admitting your suffering meant nothing. The hole reached 20 feet, then 22. Still nothing. No moisture, no dark soil, no sign of water. Just dry earth, heavy, silent, indifferent. That's the moment doubt becomes dangerous, because doubt doesn't arrive loudly, it whispers. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the water isn't here. Maybe all this effort was just wasted time. Ethan climbed out of the hole one evening as the sun disappeared behind the dry hills. His body ached. His arms trembled. He stared at the pit he had spent 10 weeks carving into the earth. 22 feet deep, 10 weeks of labor, and absolutely nothing to show for it. This is where most people reach their breaking point. Not at the beginning, not when things are exciting, but at the moment when effort and results feel completely disconnected. Ethan sat on the edge of the well. For the first time since he started digging, he allowed himself to think the thought he had been avoiding. Maybe I should stop. Maybe this just isn't going to work. And sometimes in life, the most important moment arrives exactly when you believe it's over. Because just as Ethan lowered his head in defeat, someone walking down the dusty road noticed the hole in the ground. An old man, a well digger, and he was about to say something that would change everything. The old man didn't rush. He walked slowly toward the edge of the well, studying the ground the way a doctor studies a patient. Years of digging had trained his eyes to notice things most people would never see. Ethan barely looked up. He was too tired to care. The old man stopped beside the pit and stared down into the darkness. 22 feet, 10 weeks of work. He could see the shovel marks carved into the walls of the earth. He could see the exhaustion in the shape of the hole itself. Finally, he spoke. "You dug this yourself?" Ethan nodded. 10 weeks, he said quietly. 22 feet. The old man didn't respond right away. Instead, he crouched down and picked up a handful of dirt from the pile beside the well. He rubbed it slowly between his fingers, then he smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind of small, knowing smile that appears when someone recognizes something important. "Interesting," he murmured. Ethan frowned. "Interesting?" He repeated. "There's nothing interesting about it. There's no water here." The old man ignored the frustration in Ethan's voice. He opened his palm and showed him the soil. The dirt had a faint greenish tint mixed into the clay. Dense, heavy, sticky. "Do you know what this is?" the old man asked. Ethan shook his head. "It's green clay," the old man said. He rolled the soil slowly in his hand. "Every well digger knows this layer." Ethan stared at the dirt without understanding. The old man continued. "Green clay is the hardest soil you'll ever dig through." He pointed toward the hole. "It resists every shovel. It drains your energy. It makes you think the ground is solid all the way down." Ethan let out a tired laugh. "That sounds about right." But the old man wasn't finished. He looked directly at Ethan and his voice changed, calmer, sharper. "But here's what most people don't know." He held up the clay between his fingers. "This layer only appears when you're close to water." Ethan blinked. The old man pointed at the well again. "You're not miles away from water," he said. "You're inches away." The words hung in the air. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. "Inches," he repeated. The old man nodded. 4 inches, maybe less. For a moment, Ethan didn't know how to react. 10 weeks of digging, bleeding hands, exhaustion that felt endless. And now this stranger was telling him the water had been there the entire time, just beyond the layer he almost gave up on. The old man dropped the clay back onto the ground. "This is the moment when most people quit," he said. "Not when the work begins, not when things are easy, but when they hit the clay." He looked back down into the well. "Because the clay lies to you," It tells you the earth is empty. It convinces you nothing is waiting below, but the truth is the opposite. The old man turned back toward Ethan. When the resistance becomes the strongest, that's usually when the breakthrough is closest. Ethan looked at the hole again. For the first time in weeks, he didn't see failure. He saw possibility. Because if the old man was right, then 10 weeks of struggle hadn't been wasted. He hadn't been digging in the wrong place. He had been digging in exactly the right place. He had just stopped at the hardest layer. And what Ethan didn't realize in that moment was that this pattern doesn't only exist in the ground. It exists in life, in work, in ambition, in every goal that demands something difficult from you. Because the place where most people stop is often the exact place where progress begins. And that misunderstanding destroys more dreams than failure ever could. Most people believe failure looks obvious. They imagine it as a clear signal, a closed door, a dead end, a sign that says, "Turn back." But real failure rarely looks like that. Most of the time, it looks like resistance. And this is where people make the mistake that quietly changes the course of their lives. They assume resistance means they're on the wrong path. But what if resistance doesn't mean stop? What if it means you're getting close? Think about the moment Ethan hit the green clay. The digging became harder. Every shovel felt heavier. Progress slowed down. The earth fought back. To Ethan, that felt like a warning, a message from the ground saying, "There's nothing here." But the old well digger knew something Ethan didn't. That resistance wasn't a warning. It was a signal that the environment was changing, a signal that something important was nearby, a signal that the ground beneath him was holding moisture. In other words, the clay was not the barrier. It was the door. And this pattern appears everywhere in life. You see it when someone starts building a business. At first, there's excitement, ideas, energy, momentum. Then reality arrives. Problems appear. Money gets tight. Progress slows down. Suddenly, every step feels like pushing through mud. And that's when doubt shows up. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe this was a mistake. So they stop. Not because success was impossible, but because they misunderstood the resistance. The same thing happens in relationships, in creative work, in personal growth. The moment things become emotionally uncomfortable, people assume they've reached their limit. But limits are rarely where we think they are. Most limits are psychological interpretations, not physical barriers. We feel pressure, we feel fatigue, we feel uncertainty. And our brain translates those signals into one simple message: something must be wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if pressure is simply the cost of approaching something valuable? Because breakthroughs don't happen in comfortable environments, they happen under tension. Pressure builds, resistance increases, everything becomes harder, until suddenly something gives. That's what a breakthrough actually is. Not luck, not magic, but accumulated pressure finally cracking the barrier that was holding everything back. The tragedy is that most people never reach that moment. Not because they lack talent, not because they lack intelligence, but because they walk away the moment they hit the clay layer. They confuse difficulty with impossibility. They confuse resistance with rejection. And the moment they stop pushing, the water stays buried. But the people who eventually succeed understand something different. They don't treat resistance as a stop sign. They treat it as a diagnostic signal. When the work gets harder, they don't automatically retreat. They pause. They examine the situation, and sometimes they ask a very different question, not "Why isn't this working?" but "Am I standing right on top of the clay layer?" Because if that's true, then the next few inches might change everything. Understanding the clay layer changes how you look at struggle. But understanding alone isn't enough. Because in the moment when pressure rises, when fatigue builds, when doubt starts whispering in your ear, philosophy disappears. Emotion takes over. And that's why you need something stronger than motivation. You need a framework, a way to recognize the clay layer while you're inside it. Because when you're standing in the middle of resistance, everything feels confusing. Progress looks invisible. Effort feels wasted. And your mind begins constructing a dangerous story. This isn't working. But that story is often built on incomplete information. So the first step is simple. Not easy, but simple. You learn to recognize the pattern of the clay layer. The clay layer almost always arrives the same way. First comes excitement. You start something new. Energy is high. Momentum builds quickly. Then comes the slowdown. Progress becomes less visible. The work demands more effort. The same actions suddenly produce smaller results. That's when frustration begins. And most people misinterpret this moment. They believe the slowdown means the idea is failing. But experienced builders, creators, and leaders see something different. They recognize the slowdown as compression, pressure building beneath the surface, and compression means something important is forming. The second step is this. When you hit resistance, slow down, but don't stop. Most people react in one of two ways. They quit completely, or they panic and push harder in a chaotic way. Both reactions come from fear. But the well-digger understood something Ethan didn't. When the soil becomes dense, you don't abandon the well. You become more precise. Every movement matters. Every inch counts. You keep digging, but you dig with awareness, because the goal is no longer speed. The goal is breakthrough, and breakthrough requires consistent pressure applied in the right place. That leads to the third step. You stop measuring progress by immediate results, and you start measuring progress by persistence through resistance. When Ethan believed the well was empty, every shovel felt meaningless. But once he understood the clay layer, the same shovel carried a different meaning. Each strike wasn't random effort, it was pressure applied to the final barrier. That shift changes everything. Because when you know a barrier exists, and you know it has a limit, then every effort brings you closer to the moment it cracks. That's the mechanics of breakthrough. Pressure, consistency, precision. Not dramatic bursts of motivation, not heroic effort followed by exhaustion, just steady force applied to the same point, long enough for the structure to give way. And the people who eventually succeed in any field understand this deeply. They don't treat resistance as proof they should walk away. They treat resistance as information, a signal that tells them where the real work begins. Because the well is rarely empty. Most people simply stop digging a few inches too soon. At some point, persistence stops being about effort. It becomes about identity. Because anyone can push forward when things feel hopeful. When progress is visible, when results arrive quickly, when people around you say, "Keep going," that kind of persistence doesn't require strength. It requires momentum. But the clay layer destroys momentum. That's its job. It removes the excitement. It removes the easy progress. It removes the emotional rewards that normally keep people moving. And what remains is a very uncomfortable question. Who are you when the results disappear? Are you someone who works when the outcome is guaranteed? Or are you someone who stays long enough for the outcome to appear? This is the line that quietly separates most people. Not intelligence, not talent, identity. Most people unknowingly carry an identity built around quick feedback. They stay committed as long as effort produces visible results. But the moment results slow down, their identity collapses. They begin negotiating with themselves. Maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe I should try something else. Maybe this path just isn't for me. But the people who reach breakthroughs operate with a different internal rule. They don't define themselves by results. They define themselves by standards. A standard is different from motivation. Motivation fluctuates, standards stay. A standard says, "I don't stop when things become difficult. I stop when the work is complete." And that mindset changes the way resistance feels. The clay layer no longer looks like a wall. It becomes part of the process, something expected, something temporary, something that appears right before the ground gives way. The well-digger understood this. He had seen it dozens of times. Men digging with energy, men digging with hope, and then men quitting at the exact layer where water waited beneath them. Chatating, not because they were weak, but because they didn't realize what they were looking at. They thought they had reached the end, when in reality, they had reached the threshold. And the people who eventually succeed in life carry one quiet belief that keeps them moving when others stop. Not optimism, not blind faith. Something simpler. They believe that when resistance becomes intense, they may have just reached the clay layer. So they don't panic. They don't retreat. They keep applying pressure, steady, focused, patient. Because if the well-digger was right, then sometimes the difference between failure and success is not talent, not luck, not timing, just 4 inches of persistence. Right now, think about the thing you're closest to quitting. The project, the goal, the change you started but haven't finished. Ask yourself one honest question. Are you truly at the end of the road? Or are you standing in the clay layer? Because most people don't fail because the well is empty. They fail because the ground got harder. So before you walk away, before you close the chapter, remember this. The difference between giving up and breaking through might not be years of effort. It might be 4 inches. And the only people who ever find water are the ones who keep digging.